In our last lecture, we began our discussion of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency with an overview of the 1932 election and the enactments in the first 100 days after he took office. In this, the third lecture in our AHI course on the Roosevelt and Reagan presidencies, we will discuss the other new measures he produced as part of the New Deal, up through Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, and his re-election the following year. An essential part of the New Deal was government's new relationship to the money supply. The banking crisis has caused a great deal of money to be withdrawn from banks by frightened investors who didn't believe their deposits were safe. At the same time, foreigners were withdrawing gold from the Treasury due to a lack of confidence that they would be able to redeem their dollars in gold as the gold standard, which the U.S. had been on officially for about 30 years, had called for. Roosevelt hoped that with the 4-day bank holiday he had declared, which was then approved by Congress, the reopening of the banks would see much of the withdrawn currency redeposited in them. The president was also authorized to direct the Federal Reserve System to issue paper currency that would function as money, even though it wasn't backed by gold. Instead, the new money was backed by the assets of the banks in the Federal Reserve System. Much of the money that had been taken out of the nation's banks was in fact returned by the depositors when they reopened. Just a month later, in mid-April, Roosevelt took the U.S. off the gold standard. The idea was controversial. Bernard Baruch, one of the era's economic gurus, as a financier, stock investor, and philanthropist, warned, "Money cannot go back to work in an atmosphere filled with a threat to destroy its value." But a major factor driving FDR's decision to stop the gold standard was the apparent need to raise commodity prices, that is, the prices for farm products. That would be easier if the dollar was no longer tied to gold and its value could be set by the market. The dollar would then be cheaper, the thinking went, and therefore foreign buyers would buy more U.S. farm products. With this growth in demand for them, they would fetch higher prices and farmers would thus be better off. The whole problem before us is to raise commodity prices, the president explained to the press. Let the dollar take care of itself. Another reason to abandon the gold standard was that this would make it easier to fund the New Deal. Although it was controversial within his administration, FDR stuck by his decision. As with its retroactive authorization of Roosevelt's temporary bank closure, Congress endorsed the action on gold and passed legislation that invalidated the clauses in public and private contracts, which stated that payment must be in gold, known as the gold clauses. Another essential part of the New Deal was the Public Works Administration, which provided the nation's stricken economy with more economic activity and the nation with more public buildings and infrastructure. But its director, Harold Ickes, was very cautious in spending money, so it didn't have a large impact initially. Seeing this, Roosevelt decided to ask another member of his administration, Harry Hopkins, to provide more employment. This was done by creating yet another agency called the Civil Works Administration by executive order in November of 1933. Within just a week and a half, Hopkins had put more than 800,000 people to work, and by early January of 1934, the figure was more than 4 million. The CWA lasted less than half a year, yet injected a reported nearly $1 billion into the economy, the vast majority of it through wages paid to its workers. Among its achievements were 12 million new feet of sewer pipe, 500,000 miles of new or upgraded roads, and tens of thousands of new or upgraded schools. Also important in the Roosevelt years were his political competitors and political enemies. The three most significant competitors FDR faced were Huey Long, Father Charles Coughlin, and Francis Townsend. Long was the blustering, demagogic former governor of, and now a senator from, Louisiana. Huey's a whiz on the radio, Roosevelt had told an advisor back in 1932. He screams at people, and they love it. He makes them think they belong to some kind of church. He knows there is a promised land, and he'll lead them to it. Long's Share Our Wealth program, as it was called, demanded confiscation of large personal fortunes, higher and more sharply progressive income taxes, and the distribution of enough federal dollars to each American family so they could buy a house, a car, and a radio. Each family was also to receive an annual income of $2,500, or about twice what was then the median family income. There were also to be pensions for the elderly and free college educations. Roosevelt and his political strategy guru James Farley considered Huey Long a serious potential opponent for the presidency. Father Coughlin was an outspoken Catholic priest in the Detroit area with an estimated national radio audience of up to 40 million listeners. In the year plus after FDR took office, Coughlin increasingly turned against him after initially being a supporter, as Huey Long also had been. His National Union for Social Justice was founded in late 1934. Coughlin had previously told listeners that the New Deal is Christ's deal, but became an advocate of a silver-based currency on the grounds that this was better for ordinary people. He also advocated, along with his anti-Semitism, New Deal-type measures that went further than Roosevelt. Coughlin had become increasingly vicious in the course of the early and mid-30s. In 1936, he would call the campaign between Roosevelt and his Republican challenger a choice between carbolic acid and rat poison. He even said the president was anti-God, quote unquote, and suggested that it would be acceptable to get rid of, quote, an upstart dictator in the United States, end quote, by bullets, when, quote, the ballot is useless. Dr. Townsend, a physician in Southern California, advocated something called the Townsend Plan, whereby every American over 60 would receive $200 a month. In order to receive this benefit, people would have to retire and also spend all the money. The idea was to revive the economy by guaranteeing the circulation of additional money. The funding would come from a national sales tax. It would also mean that more people would find work. Tens of thousands of Townsend clubs cropped up around the country. At this point, a word about the economy in the first years of the Roosevelt presidency is in order. One of the most significant facts was that unemployment remained very high at 21.7% at the end of 1934, even though 2 million people had found jobs and the gross domestic product, or GDP, was far higher than it had been in the previous 2 years. The most important change was in the country's mood, which was much improved. But the president was in no position to rest on his laurels. He took note of the political strength of both Long's Share of Wealth program and the Townsend Plan. Congress, he told Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, couldn't stand up to the public pressure for the Townsend Plan, quote, unless we have a real old age insurance system. FDR's already contemplated Social Security plan took shape in the following year, 1935. He told Perkins that the committee she headed, which was authorized to draft the proposal, must keep it so simple that everybody will understand it. Roosevelt was, however, involved in shaping the plan, insisting, for example, that it be self-funding, supported entirely by contributions from employers and employees, and with no government expenditures. But, of course, it meant that money was taken out of both sides of the economy in order to build up funds before any were paid out. And there were other concerns about Social Security even then. Alfred Sloan, the president of General Motors, warned that people would no longer save for retirement. A Republican senator, Daniel Hastings, warned that in the future Congress would be, quote, helpless as a child, end quote, when faced with pressures to increase Social Security benefits. But its political appeal probably made Social Security unstoppable. Although House Republicans voted almost unanimously against the Social Security legislation on procedural votes, fewer than half opposed the actual measure. At first, only 60% of the labor force was covered by the new benefit. Farm workers, domestic workers, teachers, nurses, and people working in businesses with fewer than 10 employees were all excluded. However, the Social Security law also included other new entitlements: unemployment insurance, aid to the disabled, and support for dependent children. Social Security would eventually become one of the greatest single factors in American politics and domestic life. Republican Congressman James Wadsworth predicted, "This bill opens the door and invites the entrance into the political field of a power so vast, so powerful, as to threaten the integrity of our institutions." Another major initiative in the middle years of the New Deal was the WPA, or Works Progress Administration. The WPA, established by presidential executive order in May of 1935, was headed by the aforementioned Harry Hopkins, one of the most important members of the Roosevelt administration, whom the president praised as a man who, quote, gets things done. In its first year, the WPA put more than 3 million people to work, and over the next 8 years, it would employ well over 8 million Americans. Although not all the projects had lasting value, many were things like schools, hospitals, playgrounds, and highways. Roosevelt thought of direct relief payments as an undesirable, though temporarily necessary, response to the Depression. As he said in a speech in late 1935, most Americans want to give something for what they get. That something, which in this case is honest work, is the saving barrier between them and moral degradation. I propose to build that barrier high and keep it high. The Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, was another important program enacted in the middle period of the New Deal. The idea was to reduce poverty in rural areas by bringing them electricity, at a time when only 11% of farms had it. This was done through rural cooperatives that built both power lines and distributed the power, and it was financed by long-term federal loans at low interest. The 11% figure rose to nearly 50% by the end of 1941. In the years immediately after World War II, nearly all of the other 50% of farms in the U.S. had electricity. And finally, there was the Wagner Labor Relations Act of 1935. It was not Roosevelt's idea, but that of Robert Wagner, a Democratic senator from New York State. It wasn't even clear that the president, who had previously been reluctant to take sides between labor and management, strange as it may sound today, would sign it. But he did, after the Supreme Court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act as unconstitutional in 1935. The NIRA's collective bargaining provisions were no longer law, so there was more public support for the Wagner Act, and Roosevelt finally advocated for it and signed it. The new law established a nationwide legal framework for labor relations, laying out the conditions for elections in the workplace whereby employees would decide whether to join a union. There were also penalties against unfair labor practices and an authorization for a newly established National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to take up issues between union representatives and management and make decisions about them when they could not compromise. Most importantly, the Wagner Act guaranteed workers the right to bargain collectively with employers. In the next few years, therefore, union membership grew dramatically, bringing major changes to our economic system and to American politics. Changes that would prove lasting. These new enactments to fight the Depression had questionable economic results that we will discuss in our next lecture. But their political results, and the political results of Roosevelt's remarkable ability to communicate with the public on the concerns of the average American, were evident in his landslide re-election of 1936. Indeed, FDR had successfully redefined the 1934 midterm election as a referendum on himself, and unusually for a party in control of the presidency during a midterm election, the Democrats gained House as well as Senate seats. As Roosevelt put it, he saw just one issue in this campaign of 1936. It is myself, and the people must be either for me or against me. He told his cabinet, "We will win easily, but we are going to make it a crusade." By now, unemployment had dropped by more than a third. Industrial production had doubled in the Roosevelt years to date, and stock prices were up 80% from their lows of 1933. Farmers' income was far higher than it had been when Roosevelt was elected, and corporations, on the whole, were profitable again. A poll in June of 1936 found that 53% of Americans actually thought the Depression was over. Senator Long, whom Roosevelt had feared as a third-party opponent, had been assassinated in Louisiana in 1935, and the Republicans couldn't find an especially strong candidate against the president. The GOP, declining to nominate an anti-New Deal candidate like former President Hoover, instead chose Alfred, or Alf, Landon, the governor of Kansas. Landon's background was in the party's more liberal or progressive wing, but he had also balanced his state's budget and was considered a fiscal conservative. Landon did not really run against the New Deal, although the convention had adopted a party platform that opposed much of it. The vastness of Roosevelt's ambition in the 1936 campaign and his strong desire not just to defeat but to crush his opponents was clear. And today, my friends, he told convention delegates and other supporters in Philadelphia after his renomination, we have won against the most dangerous of our foes. We have conquered fear. He then turned more ideological, reminding his audience of his new definition of American freedom, which had been suggested too as early as his famous Commonwealth Club address in the 1932 campaign, about which we will have a bit next week. Liberty, FDR now insisted, requires an opportunity to make a living which gives man not only enough to live by, but something to live for. For far too many of us, the political equality we once had won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group had concentrated into their own hands an almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. These economic royalists, the president continued in his acceptance speech of 1936, complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. In vain they seek to hide behind the flag and the Constitution. Roosevelt acknowledged that governments could make mistakes, but added, better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. In contrast to Roosevelt, his opponent Landon had little stomach for an aggressive campaign. None of my campaign speeches will be merely an attack upon the opposition, he told a Republican senator that year. I cannot criticize everything that has been done in the past 3 years and do it sincerely. Neither do I believe that such an attack is good politics. With apparently little fear of losing re-election, Roosevelt nonetheless campaigned very hard as he sought not merely a victory but a mandate. He delivered more than 200 speeches in 60 days and fought hard to win the farm states and the West. Roosevelt's political lieutenant Jim Farley predicted the Electoral College result with complete accuracy, as the president won every state but Maine and Vermont. FDR also won nearly 61% of the popular vote, and his margin was about 4 million votes larger than it had been in 1932, also a landslide year. In addition, the Democrats made further gains in Congress, leaving Republicans at their lowest level before or since, with just 89 seats in the House and 16 in the Senate. 1936 was also the year in which the unions, or organized labor, came into their own as a major political force for the Democratic Party, and in which African Americans became a strongly Democratic constituency. In our next, or fourth lecture, we will cover the economic and constitutional results of the New Deal, including Keynesian economic policy, the often hostile reactions to the New Deal, and the case made against it by Republicans and some conservative Democrats, and Supreme Court rulings striking down a key part of the New Deal, the ambitious attempt to manage the economy known as the NIRA, but upholding other New Deal legislation. We will also discuss Roosevelt's rhetorical attacks on, and more than rhetorical pressures against, leading figures in the business world, and their possible implications.